Hello and welcome back to Mind Over Chatter, the Cambridge University podcast.
I'm James.
And I'm Nick.
And together, we're inviting you to join us in our conversations with clever, curious people here in Cambridge.
Just like you, we have questions about the world.
Deceptively simple questions. So one series at a time, just as fast as our little brains will allow, we'll bring together the best and the brightest to talk about these simple questions.
In this first series, we're talking about climate change.
Climate change is likely to affect almost every area of our lives like a toddler with sticky fingers.
So, in this fourth episode of the series, we'll explore how we can sustainably feed our growing population.
Anything particularly exciting coming up in the episode, Nick?
Well, besides your millet jokes, there was an exciting line about Singapore and their sort of ambitious plans to grow more of their own food by 2030.
Can't wait. So, Nick, who were we talking to in this episode?
Well, we talked to a historian of science and technology.
Hello, I'm Helen Anne Curry.
A plant scientist.
Hello, I'm Giles Oldroyd.
And a development economist.
I'm Shailaja Fennell.
We began by asking...
Let's start with you, Helen. Can you tell us a story about the evolving relationship between humans and farming and why food production is relevant to climate change?
I think a good place to start with that question is really in the early 20th century. And we can take a long view, obviously, on the history of farming and its relationship to climate. And there would be a lot to say there. But a lot of the most significant changes are ones that have happened in the past 100 years or so, in terms of the way in which farming has become tied up, especially with the use of fossil fuels. So we can think about the way in which we use oil now in terms of mechanized equipment. We can think of the way in which synthetic fertilizers are produced using highly energetic processes, and the ways in which maybe even the foods that we eat are packaged and where those packaging materials come from and how they're made and the ultimate effects that they have on the environment. And so all of these things that I've just mentioned, the intense mechanization, the rising use of synthetic fertilizers, the industrialization of processing and packaging, these are all things that happened really in the past 100 years. And they have made or contributed to making agriculture a very, very fossil fuel intensive activity. And that means that the way that we produce our food is a contributor to climate change and has direct effects on that.
So thinking about that sort of farming and food production, where does the sort of calorific crossover, if you will, sort of point, where the point where we're reaching a population size, but are we sort of eating more now than we ever have before, if that makes sense?
I think I might answer it from the point of view of what we know today about why we're getting fatter as a species. That might be one way of looking at it. And that might give people the thought that, well, if you're getting fatter, we're eating more. I think we're eating probably more. There is more food, but we're eating more of the wrong kind of thing. And even if we ate less, we need to eat far less. So we're eating far more polished rice, polished wheat. The cereal intake in our bodies is increasing as a proportion of others, not just in absolute terms, but because they're polished. The point I was making about sugars, they burn very quickly and we have a huge sugar buzz in our body, and that's before you even think of the consumption of sugar that goes on with it. So what's happening in our bodies is the insulin system, that system that breaks down the sugars, gets overloaded and it goes haywire, which is why we're now seeing obesity even in countries which have a lower income level, because we've all moved to this diet which is invariably overloaded with processed foods, particularly processed carbs. And that's really problematic because it completely skews the micronutrient balances, the vitamins and the minerals that we need in our bodies. And so we're certainly using the calories in a more problematic way, so that we're eating more food, but we now have so 70% of the diseases that affect human beings globally now is a consequence of our lifestyle, not of infectious diseases. And that, again, I agree entirely with what Helen says, is a consequence of the last 100 years of the particular focus that we've had in agricultural systems.
Quickly, to pick up on that one, you said the term polished. Does that mean sort of processed
Yes. So you can look at brown rice and white rice. They're the same thing, except brown rice has some of the cover layers over the internal kernel of the grain still on it. And so that's why brown bread, when you eat brown bread versus white bread, they're the same thing, but they're not the same in terms of how the body breaks them down. So the more layers you have over your seeds, the slower the body breaks it down. Therefore, the release of sugars is slower.
So if I can jump in, I wanted to just pick up on the earlier statements Helen made about the sort of massive transitions that we've seen in the last 100 years. And in many ways that adds to all of that shift in the diet. So the way I like to think of it is that the way we've solved problems in agriculture in the last 100 years, we've been extremely dependent on the chemical industry and on mechanization. That's massively changed how we grow our crops. So heavy use of inorganic fertilizers. We control pests through chemical additives, pesticides, insecticides, and we also control weeds through herbicides. So we've seen a real massive uptake in the use of chemicals in our agricultural systems and a large amount of mechanization. And that's really massively pushed up productivity that has kept pace with a lot of the increased demand from the global population. But as both Shailaja and Helen have highlighted, it's also shifted our diets. The other big change that it's had is that food has gotten cheaper and people and industries have become much more wasteful. So, I mean, as a scientist, I find that very frustrating because we're doing a lot of work to try to increase the productivity of the system. And if all we're doing is just creating more food that gets thrown away, that's the last thing I want to do with all the effort that we're putting in.
So just to go back on the couple points. So the inorganic fertilizers you're talking about, that's basically not natural poop, right? We're talking about
exactly. So when we talk about fertilizers, you've got the organic fertilizers, which will be human waste, animal waste, compost, these kind of things, which they have high concentrations of these critical nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, which really are the key components that plants need to maintain productivity. But really the most effective or efficient way of putting those nutrients into the crops is just to apply those nutrients directly. So we mine phosphates mostly from Morocco as rock phosphate. You process it into a form that's easily available to the plants. And then we're burning a lot of fossil fuels to chemically fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, converting it into ammonia, which is a form of nitrogen that plants can use. In the Western world or the sort of developed world, we're using an awful lot. 95% of our agricultural systems are using these inorganic fertilizers to drive up their crop production. And a very small proportion of the agricultural system is still reliant on the organic fertilizers, the manures, compost to drive up production.
So we've been talking a little bit about the foods that we do eat. And Shailaja was pointing out that in many ways we're eating some of the wrong foods. But thinking about crops in particular, what are the main crops that we currently rely on globally? So what is it that we're eating?
I can answer that. There's a very small handful of crops that the majority of people are eating. So maize, wheat, rice, soy, canola are really the sort of major staple crops. And then those same crops are also underpinning the feed for animals. So the chickens and pigs that we're eating are also being fed from those big staple crops. So we have a real dominance in the agricultural system in a few major staple crops. That's not the normal situation. Maybe Shailaja can comment on this, but in sub-Saharan Africa, you see a much more diverse array of crops, although even there you see a dominance in production of a few staples like maize or green banana.
The typical plate that we have at the moment that we're eating is about 14 to 15 single products from plants, whereas there are hundreds of varieties that form a more traditional aspect of eating. So in the UK, I mean, we do have this, except we've forgotten about it. So people eat oats for breakfast. That's a different kind of cereal. And going back to Helen's point earlier on, you have oats with apples. You don't necessarily want to put sugar. You've got the apple sugar. These are all different kinds of release in terms of sugars, but it's not just carbs. It's also the link with the importance of protein and the importance of fats, but fats in a form that are better for the body. So not hydrated and not hydrogenated fats, fats that can be used more effectively. Like olive oil is better than using other kinds of fats in terms of the way it breaks down in our body. So absolutely the case. And it is also, unfortunately, even in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, which have had a broader set of cereals, of vegetables, and nuts and seeds, they've also become pulled in by the end of the 20th century to that same global value chain of food. And they are forgetting the systems that they had of production. This links to the point I was making about health. So in our research, what we're looking at is food production, food consumption, and the implications on human health. And one of the features that we're seeing is that the idea of food as fuel alone rather than food as healing is also something that has increasingly been forgotten. And often different kinds of food. So I'm also interested in rice and other kinds of cereal, which have a variety that we've forgotten. So you've got a black rice. I love black rice. Bibimbap, South Korean black rice, it's delicious, but it has a different purpose. It has a different effect on the human body. And so in many historical systems, and now we're working with communities that both collect seeds and have a history of understanding where they come from within the same crop, there's a huge set of health system work that we could be engaging with, which I hope, as Giles says, means that people won't want to look at chemical fertilizers because the value is in the natural system.
One of the things that I think is really telling, or a data point that's really telling with respect to some of these issues that we've just been discussing, are the data on how at the national level diets have shifted in the past 50 years. And so what you see is that more or less across the board, diets have diversified in the sense that people are eating more different crop foods, but around the world, people have converged on the same crop foods. And so we have seen in a way, a kind of globalization of diets. And so at this one level, it looks like things are differentiating in terms of what, the average national eater would be able to access. But truly around the world, it's become extremely limited in comparison to, as Shailaja has said, the thousands of edible plants that we have eaten over the course of human history, and that we could potentially be developing as crops today.
So that small list that Giles mentioned, maize, rice, wheat, etc., that's now increasingly, the crops being eaten by a larger and larger proportion of the global population. Is that right?
Yes, but also it's less and less varieties of these crops. It's not that rice, wheat, and maize are a problem. It's we've only got particular kinds. So here's, we may use only 2 or 3 of the varieties that exist from a much bigger collection. And we've forgotten these. I mean, in 1996, there was a wonderful 3-volume book, and I'm sure Helen has more to say, The Lost Crops of Africa. And in it said sorghum, and I said, sorghum, we would think, oh, we know sorghum, it's what you brew beer with, but it's an important millet. There were 175 varieties that they identified in sub-Saharan Africa, but there were 571 actual cultivars, so they could do it as in you don't use the seed, but you replicate it vegetatively. So there is so much that exists in the system that we have forgotten, and I think it's this funneling into a few varieties that's hugely problematic. And we haven't even said in relation to climate change, but they become much more vulnerable if there's a change. We need a large gene pool of each of the species to be able to be robust and resilient going forward.
Helen, maybe you just summarize what is so important about maintaining a wide genetic diversity in these crops.
Well, and I'll very much hope that Giles jumps in here as the crop scientist. But one of the arguments that's generally given is that as we have produced crops for more specialized agricultural systems. So, or maybe it's not even specialized, but in a sense, made more uniform, so that the inputs that we put in are tightly controlled. Inputs meaning pesticides or fertilizers, or as we've developed crops that are particular for mechanized agriculture, we've made them more and more the same. But the environment around us doesn't stay the same. That insect pests and pathogens change. The climate changes, as we all are talking about right now. And so being able to go back and tap into the genetic diversity that exists in a crop, but maybe doesn't exist in the specific varieties that are being planted today, is thought to be a really important insurance policy for agriculture moving forward.
Helen's exactly right. That natural diversity that sits in our crop plants, we have been very reliant on it, particularly over the last 100 years, to underpin the development of our crops with plant breeding to optimize performance of those crops. And going forwards within that genetic diversity of our crops is a lot of important diversity that we're going to need in order to adapt to a changing climate. And associated with a changing climate, we always think of drought and temperature, but a very significant change is a shift in pests and pathogens. So the species that can survive here in the UK, for instance, will change with the changing climate. So we'll see different insect pests arriving that become new problems to our crop plants that historically were not. And so we really are highly dependent on the natural diversity that is present in those crop species in order to find solutions from breeding to provide resistance to those emerging problems.
There's also another feature about how we consider agriculture. As we go to single species, we regard the soil within which plants grow as somehow part of the inputs that we use. We're creating, it's like baking a cake, that, you know, soil is like an egg, you add it in. But actually the soil is part of the natural ecosystem. It's the world in which we live and on which we live. And the quality of the soil changes hugely. And in the last 100 years, particularly if I think of the last 50 years, the Green Revolution, the high yielding varieties in South Asia, it fundamentally changes the nature of the soil. So it becomes totally dependent on a set of chemical inputs. And it can then only have a fewer number of the species that grow. So there's a kind of interactive process between what we're doing. In economics, call it path dependency. You do something and therefore you do more of the same, and you forget there are other channels through which you can operate. And then if you have a collapse, because that particular variety is susceptible, you don't have that fallback position. And that's why things like seed banks are so important.
I'm just imagining now trying to make a cake with soil instead of an egg.
Well, think chocolate soil. That might be it.
Chocolate soil.
Okay, time for a quick cake break. Maybe a dirt drizzle cake or a Victoria compost sponge. We don't judge. Anyway, thing number one, humans eat food and have been eating food for a long time.
Now, that is an earth-shattering contribution right there, James.
Thank you very much. This is how I earn my living. But the point is, why is food all of a sudden relevant to climate change?
Well, what these guys are telling us is that most of the significant changes to how we produce our food happened in the last 100 years, and that farming has become more and more tied up with the use of fossil fuels. Think of all the mechanized equipment, mass production of synthetic fertilizers, aka non-poo, and food packaging. This has made some food cheaper, but producers and consumers are sometimes more wasteful as a result.
If it isn't silver bullets, it's waste of one sort or another. I mean, it was Hugh's smelly brown carbon in episode 2, and now not poo fertilizers this week. I can't believe my mum listens to this.
So back to food. Okay, so anything else about how we're eating nowadays that might be a cause for concern?
Yes, unfortunately. We eat lots of meat. Too much meat, really. It's not always the broad category of thing we eat, but also the specific type. So, for example, rice and wheat, great. Polished rice and wheat, not so great. And to me, polishing rice sounds like a cruel and unusual punishment. And sugar. Too much sugar, as my dentist is only too aware.
Yeah, so Shailaja mentioned that a whopping 70% of diseases affecting humans globally are consequences of lifestyle, including how and what we eat.
And what are we eating? I guess we haven't been clear yet.
Yeah, so the major crops worldwide are maize, wheat, rice, soy, and canola. We eat those, but also the animals we eat those things too.
But Helen pointed out that although individuals around the world might be eating more diverse diets, and note by the way that diverse doesn't necessarily mean healthy, so despite this, there's actually much less diversity worldwide when it comes to the crops which are being grown.
Which is not, unfortunately, a good thing, as the crops can be more vulnerable, for example, to disease or pests, when there are fewer varieties of each species.
Pets? Pets, Nick? Is that really what you mean? Like stray cats?
Pets? No, pests. Of course, pests.
And nobody wants a sick soya bean. I want to come back to risk, and I want to ask which of our foods, which perhaps of the crops that we eat now, are at risk as climate change develops. You know, which might we struggle to grow if the temperature rises, or they suffer a blight, or there is an increased prevalence of pests, or something like this.
I think it's less a sort of perception that there's a certain crops that are at global risk, rather that the crops that we're used to growing in our local areas are at risk. So, you know, as the temperature rises in the UK, it might be harder to sustain some of the fruit trees and the varieties of apples that we are very familiar with. You know, it's something like an apple is it's around for a long time, and it has to then be resistant to the changes in the climate that are happening over however long that orchard is in existence. But so it's more that we might see a shift in in the ability to grow certain crops in certain regions, and that's particularly true in the tropics, where a lot of the temperature changes, where you're really going to weather extremes, much higher temperatures, much drier environments. The traditional crops that would have been grown in those regions are going to be much harder to grow, and perhaps we need to be thinking about different new crops or adapting those existing crops to those more extreme conditions.
Does that sort of mean, therefore, if I've understood correctly, that globally we'll be able to produce pretty much the same stuff, maybe in the same quantities, but where that will be produced will be different?
That's certainly one way of adapting to climate change. When you look at the current projections, Northern Europe does actually really well. Like, wheat productivity actually goes up because you just have a longer growing season. So it's not a simple scenario where it's harder to grow crops everywhere around the globe. It's much more a local effect, that the climate is changing locally, and the crops that we grow there may be affected positively but also negatively, and it really depends on the region that you're talking about.
Giles, can I ask you a question? I'm curious, do you know about what the projections are for crops that are more water intensive, as opposed to responding to changing temperatures?
Well, I guess something like rice in California, where you're producing an awful lot of rice for export, that doesn't look like a very viable long-term solution. California, we're seeing, is experiencing pretty significant climate change. Is one of the places at the front end of that change. And a lot of the productivity in the Central Valley of California is reliant on an awful lot of irrigation water, so rice, and also the large amounts of almond production in California. These are the sort of, I think those are the areas where, anticipating one area of change that is happening in California, changes to precipitation, that's almost certainly going to affect the ability to grow these crops that are very dependent on the availability of irrigation water.
I'd like to sort of take that further. I think your point about farmers is actually central, and the ability to take the farmer along that journey and to travel that journey with farmers is really important. And I think one of the reasons, and I know people are going to say, oh, you're going to say millets again, but the reason millets are interesting is because they use less water and can withstand more temperature. And I'm not in any way saying replace wheat and rice by millets, but it's trying to understand these options, and that fact that millets go from temperate to tropical regions, and trying to think about farmers globally as a community, since we don't know where we're going to produce the wheat or the rice going forward, to think about alliances with farmers where that knowledge is shared, because the risk is a shared risk. But that is also a possibility of trying to get better schemes so that the food system doesn't break any further. I don't know if you
So
think that's pie in the sky, but over to you.
absolutely not. I mean that's really already happening. So places like the Crop Science Centre and NIAB here in Cambridge, the NIAB in particular, are looking at new varieties of crops. So one thing they're testing is soybean. It'd be great to have a good protein-based crop that we can grow in the UK. We don't have it, and soybean is a very effective crop in the Americas. But the climate in the UK is not particularly good for soybean, but you can breed soybean to have to cope with the shorter growing season, and perhaps also to be adapted to the temperature, the colder temperatures at either end, the start and the end of the growing season. So it's very likely or very possible that we can develop a soybean that you can grow and can be pretty productive in the UK. There are a number of organizations around the world that are looking at specific crops in specific regions and adapting those primarily through breeding to create new opportunities for new crops as we experience a changing climate. And I suspect in 10 years' time, we probably will see quite a lot of soybean production in the UK.
So at risk of hearing about millet again, how else will climate? Sorry, I was really cruel. I didn't mean that. How else will climate change impact what and how we can eat? So we've talked a little bit about some of the particular crops, but in a broader sense, what sort of changes can we expect to see to our diet as a result of climate change?
Can I just make the point about water? I just want to pick up that. I'll link it to the question. But Helen, I think you raised a huge issue. I mean, of course, the carbon footprint is a major concern, but the water footprint is also a huge issue. And I think one of the thing is going to be water wars about who's got the right to take water to produce what kind of food. So Singapore produces only 10% of its food at the moment. It imports 90%, and it can afford to do that because it's producing other goods. But it's recognized this, and it says 30 by 30, that's a plan. So 30% of its food is going to grow through vertical agriculture, so growing it in a very non-traditional way in Singapore by 2030. So I think we're going to see changes where either countries make a decision that they're going to produce food because there's food insecurity. And I think I was triggered by what Giles said. This year over the lockdown, we've been buying, vegetables and fruits in different ways, and I've been trying to source them locally. And I was delighted to find local chickpea grown, in East Anglia, which I could purchase. So some of it's already happening.
I think that going to this point that Shailaja made about farmers, farmers are actually they're not stuck in their ways. They really are many farmers looking to innovate. They are open to new crops and to testing new ideas. And I think that's great. We want a farming community that's adapting to the changing climate. But I think one of the biggest challenges for the farmer is risk. And climate change really increases risk. So the biggest problem, for farming with climate change is you don't know how much rain you're going to get. It's much less predictable. You might get way too much and your field is flooded. You might, like this year, have a very, very dry spring. And our productivity in the UK for wheat has been awful this year. And it's because we had that beautiful, hot, dry spring that we all were enjoying in the first lockdown. It was awful, bad news for the farmers because there just wasn't enough water at the early start, at the beginning of the season. And that variability is very hard to manage for the farmers, and that risk is something that's difficult, and it's difficult for farmers in the UK. It's even more challenging for a smallholder farmer in Africa, where you could have a complete drought and lose almost the totality of your crop. So how farmers manage that risk is, I think, going to be one of the biggest challenges going forward.
And Helen, is there perhaps anything from history looking back? Although, of course, I imagine climate change today is unlike anything I suspect that we've seen in recent history. I hope I'm correct in saying that. But is there anything that we can learn looking back over the past couple of hundred years about how climate change might impact our relationship with food?
I don't know that I have a clear vision of how history offers us lessons. Just listening to Shailaja and Giles here, I think it sounds like one of the things that we maybe need to anticipate or think about is the way in which predictability uh, goes down as climate fluctuations go up. And so we very much have created industrial systems that rely on inputs being standardized in particular ways, and maybe the same kinds of things coming in year after year on schedule, right? When we think about the kinds of foods we're used to seeing at the grocery store, and how even from the referring again to the lockdown experience, how distressing it is to arrive at the grocery store and see something's not there. But maybe the idea is that in the future we might get more used to fluctuations in the kinds of things that are available, instead of demanding that there be the same kinds of rice year in, year out, or having inputs into more processed food products be exactly the same.
But that less predictability is going to affect price. Probably more than anything, food will become more expensive if it's harder to be consistently produced at the same levels. We saw that in the 2007 when wheat prices went way up. We saw riots, food riots in Egypt in particular, for instance, that really affected the political landscape. And I anticipate that that's probably, we're just seeing the start of things to come, that the stability of food prices is not going to stay the same. We've been in a long period of reducing the cost of food going down. I don't see that going forwards, coping with climate change, we're going to be able to maintain that constant reduction in food prices. And in fact, I would expect a lot more fluctuations.
I think, Giles, that's a really important point. And I think it might also be a standstill moment, a lockdown. We stand still in terms of thinking about what are the more appropriate prices, and should we not signal something that's high water use and something you want to grow. And of course, it might be delicious. We might grow mangoes in the UK. We have European mangoes being sold at the moment. But the water demand, the other demands, people should. How do we signal to consumers as well that this is something valuable, therefore you pay a greater price? It's a huge shift from the past, where at least over the last 50 years we've produced more, but it's producing at a cheaper level. And I think that is not taking into account the full cost of the inputs. And of course, we've already said they're not necessarily the best kinds of inputs going forward, but I think changing the way we think about the price of food. And Helen, I might be wrong, but is it not the case that we're spending far less as a percentage of our total income in the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century, and now than we were in the 19th century? I'm not saying that we should be hungry again, but changing the way we think as consumers, where we spend our disposable income.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case, that we spend far less now as a percentage of income, for example, here in the UK, than in the past. Absolutely. And I think it's important. We haven't really talked about things like grocery stores and the the ways in which here in Britain we get our food, most of us, most of the time, and the effect that these kinds of sales outlets have had on driving and reorganizing the food system. And so there's actually ways other than crop scientists and farmers that we might think about influencing the actors who influence what our food looks like and how we get it.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I feel like as the crop scientists, we are working hard to optimize the productivity systems and drive up the sustainability of the system, and also having huge impacts on that cost of food production and bringing the cost of food production down. But closely related to that cost, to the reduction in the food prices, has been an awful lot more waste. And that's in part the consumer, but a lot of it is just how the food is sold. So we're used to our shelves being completely full at the supermarket, and that to have our shelves completely full of all the selection means that there's always a large amount of that food is going to waste. With about 30% of the food we're producing is going to waste. And I as we look forwards to a more unstable climate, a larger population, a more demanding population, I really hope we can find a way to not just at the bottom end of it, where the crop scientists sit, improve the way we can grow the food, but also reduce the amount of waste that we're producing at the other end from the retailers and the consumers.
It's not just having, I was just going to say, it's not just having full shelves that are full, but also fruit that is perfect, vegetables that are unblemished, this kind of thing.
And I think, if I may, it's also that we only use one part of the plants and we throw the rest away. Whereas previously they would have been part of the system. So wheat, we would have used the stalk to actually, thatch our roofs. And we don't seem to understand that the plant system could be far more effective. So we could do more with less if we rethought some of those features.
Okay, so we've just been hearing about how we're not getting the most out of the crops we are able to grow now. Yet another form of waste.
And it sounds like soon, climate change is going to make it much harder to grow certain crops where we're used to growing them. This is especially true in tropical climates. The thing is, as we're learning, different places will be affected differently by climate change, and this is just as true when it comes to crops.
And the National Institute of Agricultural Botany, that's NIAB if you're down with the plant scientists, which I definitely am, and the Crop Science Centre in Cambridge, they're looking at ways to develop new varieties of crops that can be grown in challenging climates, like soybeans in the UK. Healthy soybeans, though, not those sickly soybeans from earlier.
So, how is climate change going to affect our diet?
Well, firstly, we're probably going to end up eating more locally grown foods, as farmers look for ways to adapt to the challenges and risk imposed by climate change. For example, Shailaja said that Singapore, which only produces 10% of its food at the moment, is hoping to grow 30% of its food through vertical agriculture by 2030, which means growing food on vertically inclined surfaces or stacked layers. Horizontal agriculture is so 2020.
Another issue we'll have to contend with soon is that our industrial and economic systems rely on things staying pretty much the same year on year. So, we might have to get used to more variability in the availability of certain foods, and this could affect food prices.
Exactly. The cost of food has been falling for quite some time now, but this will get harder to continue as climate change kicks in.
Maybe we should be making clear just how expensive certain foods are. From a climate perspective, think about water-hungry almonds or rice grown in California. Maybe these should be labelled so that people know exactly what they're paying for, or what the costs are in CO2 or water, like Hugh talked about with the idea of a carbon footprint plane ticket in episode 2.
Can't we just, ask scientists to work this one out for us? Bring down the cost of producing food, pretty please?
I'm not really sure that's how it works. I'm just going to jump in here, and you've sort of touched around the subject, and I think I'm just building off this last point, but we've sort of talked about like the costs of inputs and risks and productivity, the price of food, carbon footprint. You've talked about everything so much, and it's been great. But thinking of the future now, this is a scale and a sort of population question, really, that Giles has sort of touched on. Is there, going forward, is there sort of going to be a shortfall between what we produce now and what we will need to produce by 2050, say, based on an increasing population?
I do think there's a bit of a perfect storm coming where the population is continuing to expand. Most of that, the future population expansion is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And associated with that very significant population growth has also been an increase in wealth. And as people become more wealthy, they start eating more meat. And so a shift in diets. So we've got more people who have bigger demands on the system because their diets are changing. And that's all happening at the same time as climate change is happening. So it is hard to imagine how we cope with all of those factors come 2050 over the next 30 years. I think there are some fantastic opportunities, and I do think there's some fantastic opportunities to drive up the sustainability of the agricultural system so that agriculture is contributing less to climate change. But the challenge is how do you drive up sustainability in the system while also maintaining the high level of productivity, while actually even increasing that productivity to meet the increasing demand from the population and coping with climate change? It is going to be a challenging 30 years for those of us who work in agriculture.
And if I could just add there, I think another important piece of that, or something that I would say is central to it, is addressing global inequities, right? And that rising standards and rising demands on the food system are the ability to meet those are well, there's differentiation across the globe, but then also within societies, and we really need to be addressing issues of inequity at the same time that we're thinking about meeting these challenges.
I completely agree with you, Helen. I actually think in that regard, there's a huge opportunity because 70% of the world's poorest people are smallholder farmers, and they get most of their income from the farm. But for the average smallholder farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, they're producing 15-20% of the potential productivity of their farm. So there's a real fantastic opportunity here to both address the need for food, but also to drive up the productivity of those farms and provide a route out of poverty. I think there is a real great opportunity. And in some ways, when you look at the whole global system, it's much harder in the UK here, where we're achieving 80 to 90% of the potential productivity of the farm, to raise that productivity further. But for a smallholder farmer who's getting such low yields, you've got loads of opportunities to raise up their productivity and also provide them a route out of that poverty.
I think, Giles, you're absolutely right. But I'd like to add that inequities in countries between the middle classes who are consuming a lot more meat and what the farmers can produce is also a point that we can engage with. So the middle class is also excited in new ideas. So if there's a global as well as middle class idea across countries that eating well is important, then there's an emulation effect. Other people want to emulate and the farmers can sell. Hence the quinoa story, which went globally and is also something that middle class in emerging countries in the middle, the Brazils, the Indias, the Chinas, are also looking at more than they would have before. But there's also this issue of inequity among rural. So while there's smallholders, and that's really important, there are also landless labor who are at the bottom of that pyramid as well. And how we conceive of the rural as a diversified agriculture where we do the processing as well within the system adds value. So you have the increase of productivity of the crop, but associated with that, the value creation so that there's more income held in the rural economy. So I think inequities within country and also within sector are worth bringing into the play.
And if I can just follow up on that, what could we perhaps do to try and innovate and support in this sense? So if there are possible solutions that would help reduce those inequities you just mentioned, what can we try and do to support those?
Well, one of the biggest problems for smallholder farmers in Africa is that they don't have access to inorganic fertilizers. That's one of the main reasons why their productivity is so low. They can't afford to buy the inorganic fertilizers that we rely on here. So the research that we're doing is trying to find alternative routes to deliver those nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, in a manner that's independent of the application of inorganic fertilizers, and to put those technologies in the seeds. So there's already the microorganisms in the soil that can deliver those nutrients. We just need to have the crop plants engaging with those microorganisms and accessing the nutrients through that route.
And in the research that we're doing, we're trying to see what systems exist in countries where there are traditional systems of using, and as both Helen and Giles have said, to then bring it up to the technological level, because without a doubt we need to increase productivity, but making explicit the link between food system and health systems, because we've tended to think as people in the academic world in silos, and each discipline quite rightly is thinking of what we can do best, but returning to the real world where food and health are closely related, but we have, in the last 100 years, they've separated themselves out. Bringing that back, closing the circle, is something that's extremely important if we are going to, by 2050, have a more equitable system.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, beyond the research that we do, we need to be making demands from national and international leaders and institutions to put in place the governance that makes it possible for example, for small farmers to survive bad seasons. We need good governance in addition to scientific research, in many different ways. I think kind of too many to list.
I'd like to pick up on that point that Helen made, that it really is there's many disciplines involved in here. I feel like I sit at one end, the very far end of the spectrum, developing the crop plants. And I don't think we're going to have a silver bullet there. We can help in the whole system, but there's steps along the way in the agronomy, how we grow the crops, but also in how we sell the food, in how the consumers engage with their food systems. I think all of it's going to contribute to finding those solutions. So it really is a multidisciplinary problem that we have to engage all the way from the scientists at the bottom end all the way through to the policymakers, as Helen highlighted.
Giles, you just mentioned silver bullets, and I'm not asking for silver bullets here, but just a sort of thinking of the future, what sort of fuels hope, and what are the sort of reasons that we can, be optimistic?
I feel that we've been overly reliant on the chemistry industry to solve the problems in agriculture. But what in my lifetime as a biologist, I've experienced a revolution in biology. I mean, it's driven by many factors, but the ability to sequence genomes and just to understand the totality of the gene content of any number of species, and now even within species, the diversity that exists, it really increases what we can do in biology. I believe that we're really on the cusp of a biological revolution in agriculture, where we can use that amazing genetic diversity that's present in our plants, not just our crop plants, but more broadly, and bring all of that genetic diversity to the fore in our agriculture. And if we really bring that to the fore, I think we can find much, much more sustainable ways to produce our foods. For instance, reducing the reliance on inorganic fertilizers. But in fact, I think we can turn the whole system around. Right now, the system, we're pouring a lot of chemicals into the system. They're getting out into the environment. They're not supporting the soil very well. So the system is emitting carbon and emitting nitrogen and emitting all these greenhouse gases, releasing nutrients into our biodiverse environments and having negative impacts in that regard. So I think we can be very ambitious about how we can change the whole agricultural system to be an awful lot more productive by relying on the natural processes that already exist in existence in the plant world, rather than being so dependent on the chemical industry to deliver our problems.
I think what's really fascinating is that this is a moment where we can look back to look forward without necessarily going back. And I think what is clear is while we can worry that the food system is broken, it's also an opportunity to put the parts together. And we know there's lots of exciting ways in which, as you said at the outset, food is at the core of human life, and we all like talking and eating about food. And for me, that's the amazing feature at the moment, the slow food movement, the understanding of different kinds of food. Helen made a really important point. At one level, there's a huge diversity in what we eat. If we can link that excitement that we have in the global north about these things, the repositories of the knowledge, the seeds, but the communities as well, are in the global south. And while Giles is right, I mean, there is food hunger and we need to resolve it. There's also a really important idea. If food is human life, we need to value the humans who are part of that living system. And in that sense, using what communities have provides a way to link that system together. So my current research is with all sorts of people, plant scientists, but also archaeologists who are doing things like mapping traditional systems, what we call the intangible heritage. A food is important because it reminds you of all sorts of things in your past or in your community. So we bring that excitement back in. And I think we need to ensure that food stays a subject of a debate. So I'm inviting myself onto another podcast in 5 years, if you like. But I think for me, that's the core.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that perspective. I think if there's a hope, it's that at least with respect to food systems close to home here, that some of the excitement and awareness about food and its possibilities might create opportunities that didn't exist even in the recent past to diversify what we do, and therefore what consumers can find. I think the British grown chickpeas that were mentioned earlier, at least the ones that I get, are from a company that specializes in diversifying beans and other crops that are grown locally, and so I think it might be the case that you wouldn't have been able to a decade ago or 20 years ago at maybe the sort of a different point in the history of industrial food here. You might not have been able to find some of those things, but there are increasing possibilities, and maybe that's a sign that things are moving in a direction where we can think differently.
So, we started off this episode by thinking about how food is such an important part of human existence. And then we started to talk about how our food production is being threatened by global warming.
Plus, there's our own technological developments, which in the face of global warming actually might make our food production more variable and damage the environment in the process. So, thinking of industrialised agriculture, the lack of genetic diversity among our crops, and the use of inorganic fertiliser.
Well, in the face of this perfect storm, as Giles called it, is it too much to hope that this might also be an opportunity to try and work out that itsy-bitsy problem of global inequality? By the way, that film ruined my ability to travel on boats.
Well, 70% of the world's poorest people are smallholder farmers who get most of their income from their farms. Science could help these farmers increase their productivity. For example, Giles is finding ways of growing crops efficiently without needing to use inorganic fertilisers. You should know by now that those are the non-poo fertilisers. By helping plants work with natural microorganisms living in the soil to get more nutrients from their surroundings.
And Shailaja was keen to point out that there is a close link between food and health. So if we can re-diversify diets globally, then that might have a positive impact on human health.
And Helen reminded us that we need to demand that governments around the world help with inequality too. Once again, science can't solve everything for us.
I had been holding back, but dare I say that there's no silver bullet?
Yep, you went there.
But there are reasons to be optimistic. One of the things Shailaja and Helen told us is that even just getting people thinking and talking and excited about food really helps, which I guess is great news.
Yes, so hopefully, if we're thinking more about what we're eating, we can devote some of that thinking energy into developing more sustainable eating habits, like eating local with British-grown chickpeas, an example of what's becoming possible these days.
Nick, millet came up quite a bit. Ever tried it?
I took part in this entire conversation, and I'll be honest, I've kind of forgotten about millet.
I'm pretty sure millet is what we used to feed our budgies when I was a kid.
That's what I was thinking. I always thought it was bird food. But I must be totally wrong. It must be in so many foods, apparently.
I mean,
I don't know. Now I feel like I didn't take part in a conversation.
I suspect there are some things that birds eat that we too can eat, like millet.
I agree. They eat corn. They eat corn, don't they? You're not talking about the fat balls we put out in the winter, are you? I don't want to eat those.
Who puts out fat balls for birds? As it just balls of fat?
No, they're like, I don't know what it's in them, but they're like, they feed your local blue tit and robin and stuff like that. I don't know what's in it. It's probably locally sourced, and I'm having a locally sourced guilt trip right now.
Because we just, the birds in our garden, we just say, fend for yourselves. Don't give them anything, let alone spheres of fat.
Yeah, I think you just walk into a shop and go, can I have a sphere of fat to feed the bird? I think what you get, apart from weird looks, they might just point you to the birdseed aisle on aisle 9, but I don't know.
I remember that song, isn't it, in Mary Poppins, come feed the birds, feed them balls of fat. That's how the lyrics went, no? Okay, so what will we be talking about next time?
Well, in the next episode, we'll talk with Richard Staley.
My name's Richard Staley.
Sarah Dillon.
Hello, I'm Sarah Dillon.
And Martin Rees.
Well, I'm Martin Rees.
About why it has taken so long for climate change to be taken seriously.
I am looking forward to it as ever. In the meantime, I'm off to research some sustainable cookie recipes, ideally ones made entirely from millet.
There's that millet again. So, while James does that, please like and subscribe to Mind Over Chatter on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Make sure to leave us a review.
A good one, please.
And as ever, don't forget to tell your friends, family, local politicians, and each and every member of Parliament individually, one at a time.
Basically, just tell everyone you know.
A huge thanks once again to our guests, Giles Oldroyd, Shailaja Fennell, and Helen Anne Curry. And as ever, to Naomi Clements-Broad for production and general lurking.
Music was by Carlo Ladd and artwork by Alex Sadler.